So this is Romans 14 Unplugged, feasts and fasts and food. Oh my. We looked at who are the weak from Christian perspectives, and it's no secret that the prevailing Christian perspective is that the weak in this passage are weak Christians who are primarily Jewish Christians who have a preference for keeping the Torah of Moses. Said another way, they are Christians who are strong in their faith in God and strong in their faith in Jesus, but they're weak in that they still depend on an old lifestyle. This is the words of modern Christianity today, and historic Christianity. So the weakness of these weak individuals, these weak Christians, is tied to their continued dependency or continued preference for keeping the Torah. Mark Nanos, one of the writers that we've been interacting with the most, his description of traditional Christianity's view of the weak is this. Mark Nanos says, quote, "There's almost universal agreement, it appears to be an almost unquestioned fact, that the weak were Christian Jews who still practiced the law and Jewish customs, with most maintaining that this group would have included God-fearing Gentiles as well, and that the strong were Gentile Christians as well as Christian Jews like Paul, who have supposedly abandoned Jewish practice." So you can see that if we identify the weak as Christians, particularly Jewish ones in Paul's day, then it leads to, if that's our interpretation, then it leads to an application from the perspective of the strong, which would include Paul and other Christians reading the letter. It leads to an application, particularly for today's modern Christians, it leads to an application, an understanding, and an assumption that the Torah of Moshe is a sign of weakness. That if you, as a Christian, whether you're Jew or Gentile, really doesn't matter, but the key is that you're a Christian and you're still keeping parts of the law, the Torah, food laws and special days, things like that. If those are earmarks of your Christianity, then without you knowing it, whether you know it or not, you're actually in the label of the weak. And because there's this assumption in the passage that Paul is admonishing the strong to stay strong, and at the same time he's admonishing, this is again an assumption from modern perspective, there's the assumption that Paul's admonishing the weak to also become strong, then what we have is an interpretation today where the strong, along with Paul, are admonishing the weak to basically grow up and to give up your old practice, to get, you need to grow in your faith and move past those elementary parts of the Bible. You need to realize that that's all done away with. It's been set aside. And so that's what I meant, that your interpretation is going to drive your application. And so I challenge that because I'm a Messianic Jew, which means I'm a Jew. I believe in Jesus. And I still follow after Torah, but I certainly don't consider myself weak. And I also certainly don't believe that the Bible endorses a perspective or an application or an interpretation that keeping Torah signifies weakness. Understand my challenge, my pushback to that interpretation. So we looked at also who are the weak from Messianic perspectives. And we looked at a quote from Dr. David Stern, who also, again, Dr. David Stern is he's a translator of the popular Complete Jewish Bible and the Jewish New Testament commentary that many Messianic congregations use. He also believes that if there are just manifold problems with the interpretation that weakness is tied to Torah observance for a Messianic Jew. And so his, from his commentary perspective, he said, for these many reasons, we conclude that the weak cannot be Messianic Jews who are not yet free from the law. So again, we're challenging the traditional Christian perspective. Well, having said all that, if the weak are not Messianic Jews, or Messianic Gentiles for that reason, well then who are they? Okay, that's where we're going with our commentary. And so we're using various other resources to challenge this. And I know this particular perspective, like Nano says, has gone on basically unchallenged for nearly 2,000 years. Oh, of course, it's just kind of assumed and understand that the weak are Messianic Jews who just can't give up their dependency on Torah. We love them, they're their brothers, and God loves them as well. But I'm speaking from the kind of the perspective of Christianity today. But it'd be really nice if they could just grow up and get rid of all those old ways of life, and so that they can be counted as strong and realize that they're free, and that strength is tied to freedom from the Torah. Right? So I'm speaking in kind of overstatements, kind of hyperbole, so that you can kind of understand my perspective. So we're working our way down through that perspective. And 2 weeks ago, we shared the viewpoints of a gentleman by the name of Tim Hegg, and he gave us some insights into the Greek, and we're going to look at another quote from Tim Hegg tonight. So we'll pick up our commentary starting right here. This is my own thoughts, and then we'll look at another quote from Hegg, who also is influenced by Mark Nanos. Now, in case, let me just stop for a second. Mark Nanos is a Jewish gentleman, writer, author, who put together a book by the name of The Mystery of Romans. I've got it sitting here on my bookshelf right here. And in that book, he's the one that is kind of the more recognized individual who's championing a different approach to who the weak are. And what Nanos is suggesting, I'll go ahead and read, and you can follow along, and you can tell me. Again, this is a big paradigm shift for those of you who've never heard a different perspective. And you also, let me say this before I even tell you who Nanos says the weak are. This perspective that Nanos is proposing, his thesis is best understood within the social milieu of the first century, prior to the destruction of the temple and the parting of the ways between the synagogue and the church. So we have to put our mind back to a time when the Jewish communities of the first century and the God-fearing Gentile communities of the first century had more interaction with one another at a social religious level, where Gentile believers claiming faith in Messiah could actually still be found in the predominantly Jewish synagogues. There wasn't any first century First Baptist churches on the corner. There certainly wasn't any Catholic cathedrals or any Greek Orthodox churches or anything like that. There wasn't even any Islam, So we're talking about a time period when Gentile Christianity and Messianic Jewish religion overlapped. We could say first century Messianic Judaism and first century Christianity were, by and large, much the same religion. Unlike today, where Judaism and Christianity are very much different religions. Rabbinic Judaism is far removed from biblical Judaism, and is certainly diametrically opposed in many ways to Christianity, evangelical Christianity, Catholic Christianity, Orthodox Greek Christianity. So Judaism, Christianity, today, two different religions. But in the first century, they were closer together in their beliefs and their practices, and most importantly, in their faith communities. And that's going to help us better understand the proposal that Mark Nanos is making. So having said that, let me pick up my commentary. This is my own words. I write, quote, and in case you did not catch it in the above citation, Hegg, speaking of Tim Hegg of TorahResource.com, Hegg clearly adopts Nanos' viewpoints on the identity of the weak and the strong, as can be observed from this additional lengthy quote from Hegg's commentary to the book of Romans. So let's read this, and you'll catch it. And in case you don't catch it, I'll just tell you after we read Hegg. This is Hegg, quote, Mark Nanos has made another suggestion, one that I think fits the context of the message of Paul. He suggests that those weak in faith are the Jewish members of the synagogue who had demonstrated a genuine faith in the God of Israel, but who were still in the process of being convinced that Yeshua was the promised Messiah. You understand what I'm saying there? Mark Nanos proposes that the weak in faith are not Christians, and that their weakness is not an indicator of their continued loyalty to Torah. That's not the definition of their weakness from Paul's perspective. Instead, what Mark Nanos suggests, that the weak are actually members of the greater synagogue community, which would include Gentiles who come to believe in Jesus. That's part of the greater synagogue community. These Jewish people have a faith in God and a loyalty to Torah, but they have not yet made a decision that Jesus is Messiah. Now, I have to keep clarifying this. We're not talking about rebels. We're not talking about people who are guilty of committing what we call the sin of B'yad Ramah, where we have a sin of an upraised arm, literally B'yad Ramah, described in the Torah as someone who's rebellious, someone who's living in open defiance against God's Messiah, or against God's promises, or against God himself. So we're not talking about these rebel-rousing Jews who would always follow Paul around and try to stir up contention and seek to tear down and dismantle Paul's gospel program. They would follow him from place to place. They took vows. You can read about this in the book of Acts. They took vows that they wouldn't eat or sleep or drink until Paul was dead and things like that, as murderous threats. Not that kind of unbelieving Judaism. That's not the weak that Paul is describing. Rather, he's talking about Jewish people who are open to the prospect that Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah that they themselves are still earnestly seeking. So they have this vibrant relationship with God and a loyalty to Torah, and they are in decision mode. They're open to receiving the idea that this Jesus, that their fellow Messianic Jews and these God-fearing Gentiles, these Christian Gentiles that are joining the group, they're open to listening to them and dialoguing with them and considering the prospect that this Jesus really is this person. So they have a hope and an expectancy of Messiah, but they haven't yet come to the place maybe where they've made a vocal public profession that Jesus is that Messiah. These would be the weak. Their faith is weak in that they haven't laid hold of faith in Messiah yet, but they do have faith in God, and Paul recognizes their faith in God, or their zeal for God, is how he describes it in Romans chapter 9. It's just simply not according to knowledge. He uses that same verb. I can testify of national Israel, I'm paraphrasing, of unbelieving Israel, that many of them have a zeal for God, but it's not according to knowledge, that they don't quite understand how Messiah fits the picture, and therefore they also have a zeal for Torah. They have a zeal for God and a zeal for Torah, but they're just not yet arrived. And when would they arrive? Well, based on the work of the Holy Spirit working in and among these types of social groups, they could come to a faith in Messiah, the very next day. So we don't want to write them off too soon, is the point I'm trying to make. And so that's why Paul would consider that they are weak in faith, but they're still part of the community. They are viable and valuable members of the faith community. So his admonition to the strong, particularly the Gentile Christians, is that you need not damage their relationship with God and try to uproot their loyalty to Torah, because their relationship with God and their loyalty to Torah and the continued work of the Holy Spirit, all those three are going to continue propelling these unbelieving Jews down the path of making a decision that Jesus is the Messiah. So you as a Gentile need to play your part. You don't need to destroy the work of God for something as petty as food and special days. So that's the context. All right, so Hegg continues. Speaking of the weak, their genuine faith had been demonstrated within the community, right? Genuine faith in God, but they were still considering the evidence regarding whether Yeshua was in fact the promised Messiah of that faith. So again, this is a phenomenon that's more likely to have been present in the first century era, before the destruction of the temple, before the expulsion of the Jews from Israel after the failed Jewish revolts later on, near the 130s and the Bar Kokhba revolt and things like that. Before the parting of the ways between the church and the synagogue, certainly before the formulation of rabbinic Judaism in 90 at Yavne, right? So this is first century Israel. This is Paul writing in the early to mid 60s of his time period of the first century. Haig continues, in one sense, the genuine character of their faith, speaking of the unbelieving Jews, would be confirmed by their confession of Yeshua as Messiah, right? The character of their faith in God, if and when it's demonstrated to show a faith in Messiah, then we know for a fact that their faith is genuine. But until that time came, Haig states, they could not be charged with faithlessness. Haig continues, their faith was weak only in the sense that it was not as strong as it would be when they fully espoused Yeshua, is what he's going to go on to say. Let's continue reading through Haig. He writes, thus, these who were not yet confessors of Yeshua may have held more strictly to the oral Torah of the sages, oral Torah that the followers of Yeshua had come to realize was, in some cases, to be discarded in favor of unity with the non-Jewish members of the way. I also have to pause and interject. The oral traditions of the first century were quite often at odds with the Messianic understanding of the Torah as the Gentile followers of Yeshua had begun to interpret it. Also, the oral tradition as the sages had adjudicated it many times was at odds with allowing Gentiles even into the community of Israel. Haig continues, for while a clear distancing from idolatry was to be the perspective of all those who were God's children, both Jew and Gentile, I might add, the sages had built fences which actually separated Jew from non-Jew on the basis that all non-Jews were suspect of idolatry. This is what I was paraphrasing just earlier. This, Hegg says, simply could not work in the emerging Messianic congregations where a growing majority of Gentiles were being added on a regular basis. That's the type of social situation that we're dealing with here. Obviously, there's going to be some differences and some heated discussions between these two groups that are suddenly thrust together under the banner of Messiah. Let's finish reading this paragraph here, and then we'll draw this part of my commentary to a close. So Hegg states, those who had not yet confessed Yeshua as Messiah, their allegiance was still to the prevailing halakha, right? The prevailing halakha of, I'll just let Hegg explain it. Rather than separate from their Gentile brothers, they chose the more difficult road of eating no meat for all fear that it might be contaminated by the pagan idol cults. So we have weak Jews, weak in the sense that they haven't yet confessed faith in Yeshua at a public level. Perhaps they're contemplating on their heart. Perhaps they're even a believer, but they haven't verbalized it yet. They haven't articulated it yet. But these unbelieving Jews, or weak Jews, or stumbling Jews, if you want to use the verbiage of Romans chapter 11, the stumbling/weak, they, when it comes to rabbinic halakha and it comes to eating food that perhaps was offered idols, recall the discussion that Paul had right around the same time with his letter in 1 Corinthians chapters 8 and chapters 10, where he's talking about food offered unto idols and things like that. We have these unbelieving Jews who are going to take the perspective of the rabbinic halakha that said, just steer clear from all food that is suspect. You don't reject the Gentiles, but you do reject the food that might be questionable. So perhaps that's the stance that they're taking. They, these weak Jews, were willing to adopt a vegetarian lifestyle in order to remain within the community, and we're talking about the Jewish community. And then in closing, Hegg says, yet it appears that the followers of Yeshua, perhaps the majority of whom in the Roman synagogue were Gentiles, right, especially after the expulsion of the Jews at this point in time from Rome, and yet they were returning. So we had the kind of a reversal where originally the Gentiles were the minority and the Jews were the majority in the first century, but then after the expulsion of the Jews for a brief moment from Rome, then the Gentile element within the faith communities had swelled to the majority, and the Jews who had returned to Rome and continued to form synagogue communities and integrate back into the existing communities that had survived, suddenly these Jewish people found themselves as the minority, right? The tables had turned. That's what Hegg's trying to say. So he says, it appears that the followers of Yeshua, perhaps the majority of whom in the Roman synagogue were Gentiles, instead of appreciating the extra efforts these Jewish members were exerting for the sake of unity, right? They were accusing them of failing to measure up to the full maturity that was available in Yeshua. Now notice the judgmental attitude that the Gentiles were displaying towards their Jewish counterparts, who were, when I say counterparts, I mean they were part of the same faith community, the broader faith community, but they hadn't yet made an open confession to faith in Messiah. And because of their strong tie to the existing halakha of steering clear of idolatry and food offered idols and meat that was suspect and things like that, the Gentile Christians who were the strong, instead of appreciating that these Jewish people who were not yet confessors of Messiah, even though they were seeking to accept the Gentiles and stay in the group and foster shared social relationships between Gentile God-fearers and Gentile Christians and those who were seeking to adopt Torah lifestyles and things like that, these weak Jewish members, these unbelieving Jews, were willing to go that extra step and try and receive Gentiles into their community without kicking them out, right? They weren't adopting, these Jewish members weren't adopting the strict halakha of rejecting Gentile believers, Gentiles within the group. They were accommodating them, but yet the reverse isn't happening, right? The Gentiles instead are accusing these the Gentile Christians are accusing these Jewish members of failing to measure up to the full maturity that was available in Yeshua. It seems, Hegg concludes, to me that this scenario, while not without its difficulties, best fits the context as well as Paul's admonitions. And so we're going to keep working with that thesis because I think it's very workable and it has strong support, like I said, both internally from the letter itself, the internal evidence from the Romans chapter 4 leading up to Romans chapter 9, 10, and 11, leading into chapters 12 through 16, which is the parenesis part of the chapter where Paul has this extended exhortation, but it was preceded by the parenthesis in chapters 9 through 11, where Paul conveys his extended pathos to Israel, unbelieving Israel, and explains to the Gentiles being brought in that unbelieving Israel has not been written off by God, and that you as Gentile believers need to be careful of how you view your relationship over and against greater national unbelieving, stumbling / weak Israel. So that's the context behind Romans chapter 14, and I think that's a very workable thesis.